No, validating progress. All right, hello LinkedIn. I am here with Osama Fayyad, the founder of Open Insights, co-founder and CTO of Uda Health, and co-founder of IADS, which stands for Initiative for Analytics and Data Science Standards. Today we're going to talk about, are you licensed to analyze? We're going to talk about standards around data science and analytics roles. So thank you for joining, and Osama, please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Okay, I guess I've been dealing with data mining and data science for a lot of years. Started out with a PhD in AI machine learning, then 7 years at NASA Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, then Microsoft for 5 years. Then I did my first 2 startups in the Seattle area, the second of which got acquired by Yahoo in 2004, where I became the world's first chief data officer. The title started out as a joke at the time.
Did it?
Yes, and now it became a serious thing, I guess. Then I did a few more startups, did a stint running a accelerator and technology investment fund in the Middle East out of Jordan. Moved to Barclays in London for 3 years, came back to Open Insights in 2016, and have been also very involved in Uda Health, which is a healthcare technology startup.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this live session. And for those that are joining, you can feel free to ask us questions in the comments, and I'm going to go ahead and try to get through as many as we can. But I do have some questions prepared for you, so I'll go ahead and start with that, and then I'll be reading the comments as we continue. So you mentioned you were the first chief data officer at Yahoo, and more recently you were the global chief data officer at Barclays. Can you tell us about how the CDO role has come about and how it has evolved? I know you said it started as a joke.
It started out with the executive team and Jerry Yang kind of assembled to welcome me to Yahoo and sort of say, okay, what shall we call you here? And the topic came up of chief data officer, and everybody in the room actually laughed and thought that sounded funny enough. Yahoo had this culture for irreverent titles, basically.
Okay.
Jerry Yang called himself Chief Yahoo, for example, and so forth. So that was the first really definition of what it means, and we defined it at the time as an operational role that also had to worry about kind of standards and governance and making sure everything is taken care of and well architected and so forth. So it had this dual role for me, at least in the beginning. Then I went away from Yahoo, and lo and behold, 5-6 years later, I joined Barclays, which is a 325-year-old bank, one of the major banks in Europe, based in London. And there, the contrast was significant, both because the field had matured, but by the time I remember the first time I gave a public talk as a Barclays executive, somebody walked up to me and said, do you know there's about 1,000 chief data officers in the industry? And of course I didn't mention at the time that, oh yeah, this started out as a joke.
Yeah.
So a lot of more organizations took it seriously. A lot of organizations realized the need. At a bank, there's a lot more emphasis on the governance side, on the policy side, and a lot on the privacy and the proper use of data. And especially for a European bank, where a lot of the laws are a bit more kind of evolved and advanced than in the US on how much data you're allowed to keep, how much you're allowed to use, etc. So the differences, I would say, were very significant, both time-wise and in terms of what the role is like and where you spend most of your energy.
Right. So does every bank at this point have a CDO role? Are they mandated to?
It's almost getting there. I think many banks kind of fear getting in trouble if they don't have a CDO now. The industry basically demands a accountable individual who is looking and seeing whether that organization is using the data properly, how they're using it, do they have the right limitations on its use. I used to call my role at Barclays kind of the responsible use of data. But before you can use it responsibly, you need to make sure that it's usable and available and can be actually applied in a lot of these innovative applications as well, while staying on the safe side. So one of the big programs I pushed there was, I called it from KYC, which is in banking is know your customer. It's a big area of spend. I called it the journey from KYC to UIC, where UIC stood for understanding your customer, which actually shows the business value of the data rather than just doing it for regulatory reasons, which is what KYC is all about.
Yeah. All right, thank you. So we are in Boston today. We are at the Open Data Science Conference, ODSC East, and you had a talk this morning. Can you share with your audience what you talked about, basically some key points?
Yeah, the keynote was really focused on some of the research, on sharing some of the research results we found out through the IADS, the Initiative for Analytics and Data Science Standards, that I co-founded with Hamid Hamouchou, who's also here. I started out really to motivate everyone about this. I started out with a picture of Captain Sully, and I said, would you rather be flying with this guy, and I had some images of some really bad pilots.
Wait, who's a bad pilot?
Well, you'll have to look at the slides that we shared. And then basically said the same thing in the medical profession. Would you rather have a surgeon with a good reputation, and I had stories about kind of surgery gone wrong and some of the bad practices. And then I asked the fundamental question, which is, how bad do you think things would get if you had the wrong people who claim to understand data science, kind of do the analysis, often missing out huge value that could be available in the data for the organization, or even worse, leading the organization in the wrong direction because they reached the wrong conclusions by doing the wrong analyses. And I think that's way underappreciated in the field. So the biggest economic problem we hope to address, both as a service to the field, but also as a service to companies working and organizations working in the field, is imagine now a space where you have huge shortages of talent. And there's some amazing studies that talk about the difference between the number of job openings in data science and the number of available data scientists that could fulfill those jobs. And we talked about McKinsey predicting in 2011 that by 2018 there'll be 110,000 job openings that cannot be fulfilled.
By when?
By 2018.
By 2018.
And what's amazing is LinkedIn runs this independent study, or we think it's independent of that, saying how many jobs in data science are not fulfilled, and lo and behold, they come to very close to 115,000.
Okay.
So that's the shortage, right?
Yeah.
IBM is predicting by 2020 there'll be 2.2 million data science and analytics jobs out there with similar kind of gaps in supply demand. So here's the question. You have all these gaps, you're trying to hire, you're an organization, and you've got all these candidates, most of whom are not qualified, who are actually applying and submitting their resume and say, hey, I'm a data scientist, hire me. What do you do as an organization? Most organizations their HR departments don't understand data science, their managers don't understand it, so they actually end up spending a lot of time interviewing. And we had quotes from a lot of the people that who did the survey.
Yeah.
One of them basically said, look, I had a 60-to-1 ratio between interviewing or looking at 60 people before I actually was able to hire one. And
That's
I was
pretty
lucky
good,
to
no?
hire one. I would say that's good.
That's good odds.
This person was actually complaining that it was too high. But imagine this now, 60 interviews.
Yeah, that takes a lot
Each
of time.
interview, and many of them say basically take a whole day with a lot of people from the organization.
Yeah.
We did some basic math, and we came across a number we're trying to now verify it and publish it officially. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent only on wasted interviews. Like imagine that's the wasted interview space.
The madness.
Yep.
How do we move away from that?
Well, how do we move away from that? So you asked me what we talked about. So
Yes.
the talk started out with examples of how the role is so varied that within the same company, and we used Facebook as a company, 3 different people who call themselves data scientists, you look at their LinkedIn profiles, completely different backgrounds, completely different education, completely different emphasis, right? Then, of course, we compared jobs in data science and analytics across different companies, and there the variance is even much larger.
Right.
Then we looked at both the supply and the demand. So the people, how they talk about themselves when they claim they are data scientists. And again, you see a huge variance, which is very confusing to employers. And then we looked at the supply side, which is who's training these guys, so the universities. And we actually compared several programs, both undergraduate and graduate, the curricula.
Yeah.
And they also almost have nothing in common, right? So the confusion is just growing bigger and deeper. And we think the fix,
Yeah.
and this is our mission really, is to basically define these roles and have even sub-roles. So if everybody likes to call themselves data scientists, great, we'll have data scientists type A, type B, type C, type D. Because often an organization is trying to hire a data scientist for digging through the data and dealing with big data systems.
The cleaning.
Another one wants to hire somebody who's an interface to the business. A third one wants to have really and what I would call an algorithms jockey who really knows the machine learning algorithms and how to use them, etc. So there's a huge variance, and we need to address that variance.
Yeah, there's actually several questions that came in. So Divyanash Saini asks, what kind of behavioral changes or tools getting adopted do you see coming in the future given the huge diversity of roles of people in data?
What kind of
Behavioral changes or tools that are getting adopted?
So I think the tools. So the behavioral changes, I think organizations are maturing, probably the expensive way, more than the real way, meaning they're going through good and bad experiences of hiring data scientists. Some of them are seeing the value, some of them are seeing they made bad hires and now they have to recover from that by either firing or replacing or whatever. And I think what's coming out of that is organizations are beginning to understand that, hey, we actually need to do a lot more thorough evaluation. And one of my biggest rules about hiring data scientists is it takes one to know one. So if you don't have a good data scientist on board, your chances of hiring another good data scientist are near nil.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So and then how do you start that? If you're just starting a department or you don't have a good scientist on board already, and that's why you're trying to recruit,
Right.
how do you solve that? And we believe that by developing the standards, developing good descriptions of what are the roles, what are the positions, and what is the training required for each of these roles, we can actually make it a lot easier for people to both sift through a lot of resumes and then home in on the ones that look promising, and then home in on the interviews that are likely to be valuable, and then know what to ask in the interviews. We shared a lot of feedback from candidates who basically say, hey, I interviewed at 10 different places for the same job, and the interviews, other than like 2 little bits around programming, had almost nothing in common. And each interview was a whole day affair with completely different kind of approach to it. So.
Well, one thing I'll say is if there are, let's say, 10 common questions that are expected to be asked of a data scientist, you can expect the answers to those questions to be posted on Google somewhere.
Yeah.
So people will just memorize that and come in for interviews. So that's another worry to think about.
Of course, and that's why there's no substitute
Yeah.
for doing a live follow-up where you dig deeper.
Yeah.
So it's not enough to just ask the canned question. You can actually observe, and there are tools that can control for these behaviors to find out if you're doing a video interview, is somebody actually looking somewhere else? Are
Reading a script or something?
Is somebody like sitting in the background whispering the answers? And actually, I'm amazed. There are technologies now, people are using AI to detect whether to flag something in an interview, in a video interview.
Oh, wow.
That's proctored.
Like
And there are
eyes
companies who
rolling,
offer
yeah.
these services, right? And then, that gives you a red flag, and then you drill down and say, do you really know this area? Let me ask you a few follow-up questions. And typically, somebody who's cheating would collapse very quickly.
Got it. Okay, so another question came in from Spencer. He asks, you mentioned a skills gap, which is validated by the data literacy project led by Click, who says that only 24% of the global workforce is data literate. What is the first step a CDO should take to drive data literacy and data culture within their company?
That's a great question, and one of the things that I've done personally with a lot of our engagements as Open Insights, say, with some of the largest organizations in the world, we actually quickly realized that data literacy and actually what we call data culture is a big part of making the stuff useful and usable. To that end, we actually launched something we call Data Academy in a lot of these big companies that are targeted at basically achieving data literacy. And there's literacy at two levels. There is what should a average employee know about data, why it's important to be safe with it, why it's important to be sensitive to it, why it's important to make sure it's kept safe. And then there is the parts on what's possible with it, which sort of goes more into the analytics. A lot of data analysts and a lot of business analysts don't even know the art of the possible on what you can do with data mining algorithms, with machine learning algorithms. I mean, a great example in monetization, when I joined Yahoo, within 2 years, by putting in the right machine learning systems, data management regimes, and some of the big data technology, we were able to generate, this is without much work, 800 million of additional revenue derived from targeting for Yahoo. Basically, they were selling the same ads at 10 to 20 times the price they used to sell at before. Because now they could actually do targeting that they could prove to their customers, well, this is well targeted, this is reaching the right audience, which resulted in a much better dynamic, both with the advertisers willing to pay more, the consumers being slightly happier. Nobody loves to see ads, but if you see ads that are relevant, it's a better experience than ads that are completely irrelevant or at the wrong time.
Right.
And that created a good dynamic there that actually allowed us to create value. So it's very important to have that data culture and that awareness. And part of that is both the data literacy as well as the data science literacy.
Okay, so just another follow-up question. So let's say you have a big company like Barclays. How do you actually implement something where, let's say, the average admin or somebody who might touch data once in a while but is not really a data analyst or really specialized to work with data, how much do you teach them? How much should they know?
Yeah, and it's different levels. When we ran these data academies, we did that at Barclays, we did that at Barclays Africa as well.
Yeah.
We did that at MTN, which is Africa's largest telecom. We did that at many companies in the US and in Europe. The way you do it is you create different tiers for different levels of awareness and different concepts that you want to emphasize. So somebody who doesn't touch a lot of data, we probably want them to be aware enough to understand that KPIs matter, which KPIs they should pay attention to. And our philosophy is every KPI or key performance indicator should have a version that goes all the way from the board to the CEO, all the way down to the lowest level in the company. And if you don't have that, then something is broken.
Meaning it should be the exact same KPI?
No, it's at a different level of granularity,
got it.
right? The person in the operations probably wants to see a lot more detail. The person on the board doesn't want to see any detail but wants to see the big signal.
Yep.
And where should they pay attention to what's going wrong, like which region is veering off of forecasts and so forth. So that insistence culturally on saying every report has kind of a version that goes all the way from a board to the lowest level, even though it may not go to the board ever, is kind of instills the culture of thinking about it that way. Most of the training is about awareness, and as you get down to specialized roles, it becomes more technical and more around what's possible, because those are the people who can actually make the difference and help you make stuff happen. And by the way, I've been involved personally in many data science projects where we would work hard to come up with an amazing predictor of something. One example that comes to mind was working with one of the very large car manufacturers, where we were trying to predict the sales by car, by model in different micro markets.
Okay.
The problem was very hard. We cracked it in a very innovative way. And in the end, we discovered that the executive team was unable to do much with those predictions, even though they were super accurate.
Why?
It took, so it
happened?
took basically us working with the executive assistant who prepares the, in those years, incentives on automobiles were a big deal. And we figured incentives where you pay consumers money back for buying a car were the easiest thing to reprogram, right? So you could change them by market, by demand, etc. So we worked with that EA to take the spreadsheet that goes to the executive team and just allow us to color code certain cells, as in these are red because you're probably overpaying, these are
Okay.
green, they're great, and these need attention or change. Just doing that color coding went from great predictions where people were just watching them as a spectator sport to like, oh, now I can act on it. In this market, I need to change it up or down.
Makes it a lot easier to
And now it
act.
became actionable. So, and that's the importance of basically involving everybody, because the whole supply chain of data and the consumer chain is reliant on a lot of people doing a lot of different roles.
Right. Great. Okay, so I'm also part of the advisory board of IADS, and maybe we can spend some time talking about that. So what can we expect to hear from IADS over the next few months? What are some long-term goals? And maybe let's just start with, why did you decide to co-found this?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for serving on our advisory board, and we're proud to have you. Second of all, we started it really, I mean, personally out of frustration, and I think my co-founder Hamid, out of kind of spending many years working in analytics and realizing, oh my God, you know, there's people who are doing analytics who shouldn't be doing analytics. There's people who don't understand it. There's people who are suffering. They can't find what they need. They can't express what they need. So for us, the vision is a ubiquity of these standards that we hope to develop with the community, where we define, by standards I mean, what is a role? How do you define a role? How do you define the requirements to basically qualify for that role? What are the qualifications? And how do you make that ubiquitous with everybody, so reachable, acceptable to everyone, where everybody can start looking at it and speak a new language, where they're really distinguishing and avoiding a lot of the inefficiencies. That's number one. Number two is setting the standards for how do you qualify for that role. So what kind of assessments do you administer to make sure that you know these skills? And just saying that somebody should know machine learning isn't enough. Well, depending on the job, what parts of machine learning should you test on? And which aspects? And what kinds of algorithms, etc., as an example. Same with analytics, same with visualization, same with a lot of these roles. So defining those three areas and making that ubiquitous, where it's easily accessible, easily applied. By the way, we think it's totally doable. It just needs enough energy around it and enough people who are interested in serving the field to sort of say, well, this makes sense, we should adopt it. And people will adopt it because the need is there, both for educators, for employers, and for candidates.
Yeah, I think I'm going to ask the LinkedIn audience, so whoever has joined, can you just tell us, do you think there's a need for standards around data science and analytics roles? And I'll just see what the comments come by. But let's just quickly talk about why. So you said you started this out of frustration. So why exactly do we need standards? Why can't we just all be data scientists and be happy?
Well, because there's many other jobs that need to be fulfilled. We don't need to all be data scientists. It is a great job. It is a great career. But also, to be a data scientist, much like being a pilot or being a surgeon or a doctor, you really need to know what you're doing. And we, or society, needs to know that they can trust that you know what you're doing, so that you're allowed to kind of do good or do damage in a limited way, as opposed to kind of an open field where anybody can do anything, and who knows what's good, what's bad, what's a good hire, what's a bad hire, how much should I pay. All that stuff is very hard to compare if you don't have these standards. So these standards are absolutely essential to make it a more rational process, to guide the educators on what to teach, for what role, and to guide the employers on what to look for each role.
Got it. So I know you've been doing a lot of research and surveys and interviews. Can you give us a sense of how many surveys or interviews have you completed so far?
Yeah, so far we've had over 700 survey participants, and I would encourage everybody tuning in to go to iads.org and take the survey. That's iadss.org, and take the survey, because that helps us and helps you. It'll also, and there's 2 versions of the survey, etc. We've had about 700 people from hundreds of companies. One of the surprises to me was the majority of these companies were large companies. I really thought a lot of startups, a lot of freelancers would be taking the survey. But no, what we're finding is a lot of managers, a lot of people in kind of well-defined roles in big companies are interested in taking it because they're curious and they actually face this problem. Is their HR department doesn't know how to hire, or they're not getting support, or recruiters are trying to charge them a lot of money, or candidates are demanding too much.
Yes. All right, we got some answers here. So Parag says, yes, highly recommended that there should be standards, but needs to be suitable to country laws.
Yep.
I'm thinking maybe he means EU and GDPR and stuff like that. Aditi says, as per me, data scientist is different designation with responsibility directly impacting the revenue of an organization. So obviously the standard should be maintained. Yes, I mean, I personally do think there should be standards. That's why I'm on the board. So I
Thank you.
really support your initiative. And yes, so for somebody who did not hear that, it's iadss.org for you to go in and take that survey, which will greatly help all of that analysis that's happening. I think we can move on to the next question, which is how has popularization of the data scientist role, somebody actually commented, yes, it's the sexiest role ever. That's of the 21st century, but I'm going to say ever. But because so everybody wants to be a data scientist, right? So how has that changed the expectations and of the abilities and skill set of a data scientist?
Yeah, I think what has happened is the pressures to fulfill this demand, the open roles, and some of the negative, I would say mostly negative experience, because, by the way, I mean, if you have a role which is very highly paid, it's only natural that many candidates will try, and many people looking for jobs will try to reclassify themselves as, hey, I could do data science. And in most cases, by the way, I don't blame them, because it's so diffuse in the definition. They'll say, well, I'm a data scientist because I understand something about this domain, and therefore, and I've done some analysis and I can do some charting. In other areas, the data science is much more specific and needs a lot of more technical knowledge. In some cases, it needs a lot of data engineering, etc. So what I think has happened is we have now developed both an awareness and sensitivity to the importance of the role. Organizations are now basically coming up with better ways to evaluate how a data scientist is doing. By the way, one of the surprising results in our survey asking around this question is, how do you evaluate data scientists and how are they evaluated? And there's many ways to evaluate through management, whether it's how long you've been in the role and your seniority versus how much value you're delivering to the business, etc. And it's highly skewed in data science. You're being measured by how much value you're actually delivering to the business. Which is so the two biggest factors are manager evaluation, not a very surprising thing, and the second one, which is even bigger, is value to the business. And I think that's very healthy, because that actually typically is objective. It gives you the right incentive, and the value could be money. The value could be, are you getting a better NPS, Net Promoter Score, from your customers? Are you servicing them better? It could be, are people feeling better about the brand? There's many ways to do it, right? Any of these ways to do it, cost savings, more revenue, etc. So that to me is very healthy. So all of these have driven the kind of behaviors and tools that allow you to actually measure more systematically whether somebody is qualified or not. And I think there is a danger there, because if we don't define the proper standards, you end up defining it too narrowly. So it now becomes data scientists are only like deep machine learning algorithm people. That's not true. And that's why it's important to sort of define the standards correctly, so we define the right testing tools and the right approaches to evaluating.
Right, and a popular question that usually comes up is, so how does one that's aspiring to be a data scientist, like what do they do first? Do they go back to school? Do they take the online courses? Do they just start getting an internship and try to learn on the job? What's your advice?
Yeah, my personal advice, there's several things you need to learn if you want to be a data scientist. And some of them are slightly technical, but not impossible. Nowadays, kind of knowing Python or some programming language that helps you achieve tasks is very important. I would insist that you know some of the statistics and understand kind of what these algorithms are actually doing. Personally, when I interview data scientists, one of the areas most candidates fail under is, I'll talk to somebody and they'll pull up an algorithm's name and they'll say, I applied it here and there. If I don't feel like they understand how this algorithm works and where does it fail, because most of the game is about failure and how to avoid failure,
Right.
then your knowledge is not that useful. You know, anybody can read up about an algorithm and actually run it from a program. The real problem is, are you aware enough to understand where this thing can fall apart? When does the data become junk? As far as it's concerned, what are its particular weaknesses? When do you need to kind of shore it up in these areas of weaknesses? What kind of noise sensitivity does it have?
Right.
So a fundamental understanding of the science of data, of what does it mean to build a model, which is really a summary of a data set, and what are you trying to achieve with it, and how do you measure the health of the model that you generated. Those are all important aspects that you need to have a fundamental understanding. So a little bit of statistics, some programming, and of course familiarity with machine learning. And in the fields I work in, big data is very useful. And big data, again, doesn't mean volume. It actually means variety more than anything. Meaning, if I take any data set today and I add to it a professional graph, a social graph, and some documents,
Right.
including videos and images and so forth, what do you do with it today? Well, for most databases, there's nothing they can do. And that's why a lot of these data sets today are becoming a lot less structured, a lot more unstructured, and therefore having some knowledge of big data as a platform that allows you to manipulate these kinds of data sets easily is also becoming necessary.
Yeah, and so another question very relevant to what we were talking about. So there are a lot of people that want to be a data scientist, right? But there are also a lot of technological innovations and AI that's coming into play that will facilitate or help the data scientists do their job. So do you think that skills gap is going to close because technology is going to, basically robots are taking our jobs? So is that a problem?
I think, is it at the MIT Data Lab where they came up with or MIT Media Lab where they came up with the motto, AI is not about replacing the human with a robot, it is about taking the robot out of the human. So I think what is happening with AI and a lot of these technologies is they are making our jobs easier.
Yeah.
I actually do not believe at all that they're capable of replacing our jobs. The jobs they're capable of replacing are the very mundane, very robotic, very repetitive type of tasks that I actually think machines are better off doing than humans. We need humans because to this date, we don't know how to build a machine that has something that most humans have, which is common sense, an ability to sort of quickly come up with judgments under new situations. So the analogy I like to use is much like autonomous driving. I don't think we'll see autonomous driving in the near term, but we will
near
see
term, like 3 years, 30 years.
Oh, probably more than 30 years.
You don't think so?
Oh yeah,
Really?
I don't believe so. But I
Okay.
do believe that there are many, many, many areas today where these AI algorithms can help us a lot. So avoiding collisions when it's so obvious that you're going to collide, but the driver is distracted,
Right.
and getting warnings and applying brakes
Yeah.
is a helpful one. Following lanes can be helpful. A lot of these tools that assist you do some of the tasks. For some people, parallel parking, can now be automated, and it's a good thing.
Yes. Good for me.
So in these areas, you automate much of this, but so far we have not been able to build machines that can anticipate situations that we haven't seen before and quickly react and map knowledge from another similar situation to this one and apply it effectively. And I have many, many, many examples of that, and we could talk about those, but and that's why I don't believe autonomous driving will happen, at least in my lifetime. But I think the machines will advance enough to do a lot of the mundane tasks and help me when I'm distracted or when I'm incompetent or whatever. We haven't yet figured out how to crack that general intelligence, which seems to exist in humans and many animals, actually.
Okay, so you're saying we're safe for now?
Yes.
Okay,
In
great.
fact, if anything, historically, looking at the past 2 AI winters, and I
Yeah.
think there's a new AI winter that will come because of all the hype, if anything, we created a lot more jobs than we've eliminated.
Yeah.
So you open up a whole bunch of new areas where people can do a lot of higher value work.
Right. Okay, another comment. Russell Willis says, removing the mundanity from the necessary requirements for human activities frees the human to be more responsive, creative, and proactive. Hopefully, this should be a benefit to many areas of industry rather than a detriment. Do you agree?
I completely agree, and in fact, that is completely supported. Look, I'll use a very basic example that
Yes.
has little to do with data science, but is related. Accounting of 100 years ago
Yeah.
was open up these huge ledgers and spend days adding numbers and double checking that you didn't make an error in addition. all sorts of tricks to avoid errors and to double check yourself with these ledgers that get dusty and are impossible to access.
Yeah.
Nowadays, no one at all would ever think about doing accounting without software doing the actual mundane work of keeping track of the numbers, adding them up, doing all the right things, creating the balance sheets and all of that. That to me is an example where now accountants can think about more strategic things. Was this expense necessary? Does it make sense? Could we save money here?
Right.
Could we utilize the assets better? Right? Stuff that they never had time to think about. And that's really where the value is in managing money.
Yeah, I just feel bad for that person who lost their job, He probably missed it. The
No,
whole
you're probably
ledger
doing
thing.
more creative and more valuable
Hopefully,
stuff.
for their sake. All right, so next question, still on technologies, but what's the impact of data technologies on the expectations from the business? So we've seen some new technologies come out. Did that change the expectations from the business?
Well, the biggest thing we've seen is kind of a huge wave of digitization. And actually, I think, and this is kind of near and dear to my heart, in a lot of these digitization or what's called digital transformation efforts, people start digitizing a lot of the manual tasks, making them often more accurate, less kind of repetitive and boring, faster, all of that good stuff. But data ends up being an afterthought. So what happens is they create what we call instant technical debt, because you've now built mechanisms to digitize and you forgot about, well, how do I capture the right data? How do I represent that data? How do I store that data? How do I retrieve it at the right time?
Yeah.
What level of data? Humans typically will consume data at the level of graphs and summaries.
Right, charts.
Machines, like a machine learning algorithms, wants that detail of every little transaction and what was around it. And that is completely non-consumable by human, but absolutely necessary for these
machine, yeah.
learning algorithms. So to me, what's happening now is people are now rethinking and saying, okay, if I'm really doing a proper digitization, I want to make sure that I put in the right brains and the right intelligence to actually design it in such a way where I'm capturing the right data, managing the data correctly, and most importantly, enabling the algorithms, these very finicky machine learning algorithms who only require data in a certain format and completely collapse if it's not in that format, to be able to consume it.
Right.
And that's what I think is changing now and becoming better, especially with big data, which makes it easy to deal with the different types of data.
Okay, so another question from Balaram Krishna. Enterprise risk tolerance with data balancing between information security versus information utilization. What are your thoughts on this as a CDO?
Huge and very important topic. In fact, I'm a strong believer that you can have maximal utilization with maximal privacy. You just have to be careful about how you do it. So many organizations, by the way, many organizations are obsessed with kind of data leaks.
Yeah.
And attacks and hacks. It turns out that most of the threats are internal, right? And a lot of these threats, meaning
From
internal,
employees
meaning
or
employees,
malicious mistakes.
yeah, people who intentionally or unintentionally end up installing bad software, malware, etc.
I would never, but yeah.
That's called, social engineering. That's how the
Yes.
bad guys get you to bring it in, even if you're not connected to the outside. In fact, very famous breaches happen that way, including some of the famous ones in the news. The thing I want to say here is many organizations don't think, they assume that once you're in, once the perimeter is secure, you're safe. And that's a very bad assumption. And by the way, with IoT, the Internet of Things, that's becoming a super bad assumption because there's no such thing as a perimeter in that world. So the proper practice here is simple, right? Data should be encrypted. The keys should only be accessible by people who actually have reasons to access. And the management of the keys needs to be active enough to make sure that nobody is carrying the keys for historical reasons.
Right.
And the keys get refreshed all the time. The keys can be changed instantly so that people can be denied access instantly when something bad happens. Those technologies, by the way, are available today. They're implementable today. They're just not used out of laziness. So if you do it properly and you make sure it's the proper access, often a lot of that utilization and of information can be done by algorithms. No human needs to actually look at it. And the beauty about a machine learning algorithm looking at a data set is it doesn't need any of the what we consider private information, the PIID, the personally identifiable information, for example, is useless to an algorithm. If you have a name or a social security number, the algorithm throws it out because it's a unique identifier for each data record. It has no predictive value unless it's a bad algorithm. But it will actually glean kind of the overall predictive pattern that says, oh, people, when they use this product and this feature, they tend to run into these kinds of problems. That's the useful stuff that comes out of it. Or here are customers who are looking for something and it's an opportunity for us to double our sales, right? So these things can be gleaned from the data through algorithms that can be run securely without humans actually having access to it and without endangering the privacy of that data. You just need to have a very well controlled and architected story on who gets access to the data when and for what reason.
All right, great. I think on that note, Osama, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for joining me on this LinkedIn live stream all the way from Boston at the ODSC conference. I think one thing I'll say is if you want to follow on with what IADS is doing, you should join the LinkedIn group. Just look for IADS, you'll find it. And also go to iadss.org and go ahead and take that survey. So thank you again.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks for having me here.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.